I was up flying one day, and my captain and I were halfway through a 9-hour duty day. Conversation is a prerequisite for this job. If you don't know how to do it, you're going to get very bored very quickly. He shared his stories about going through the Air Force Academy in the 1980s. I got to learn a lot about the history of the academy, how it was formed, and the interesting architecture throughout the campus. Then he started talking to me about his pilot training. He said, and I quote, "At some point, they make you jump out of an airplane. I wasn't thrilled about it. I wanted to be the one flying, but unfortunately, it was part of the process." On his first jump, they loaded into the transport. Because of the way the jump master had stacked them, he was in line to be the second one to jump. A greenback was chosen to jump in front of him, and when it was time for him to jump, he hesitated. He witnessed the jump master kicking him out the door to prevent the poor kid from injuring himself, but all you heard was his body rolling along the fuselage towards the tail. After seeing what happened to jumper number 1, he jumped with all of his might. After he departed the airplane, he looked back behind him and saw the number 1 jumper all tangled up. He was eventually able to free himself, and he pulled his reserve chute, but he was badly bruised and battered. Then it was finally his turn to be the jump pilot. He recalled having a lot of fun. He was piloting his 4th jump one day and was getting quite bored with the routine. There was one jumper in back, so he decided to have a little fun. He started a shallow climb and then pitched the nose over gently going into 0G. He looked back and saw the jumper floating in the cabin next to the cargo door. The jumper looked confused and raised both of his arms in the air, giving my captain a shrug as if to say, "What the hell are you doing?" Seconds later, my captain tapped the right rudder and kicked him out of the airplane. After landing, and upon shutdown of his airplane, the jumper started running back towards him. He was sure that he'd be reprimanded in some way. Instead, the jumper shouted loudly, "That was awesome. Can we go up and do that again?" Flashback further to about 80 years ago, and there was a 24-year-old kid that loved and embraced the same amount of risk. Now, as far as the Army Air Corps was concerned, you weren't exactly a kid at 24. In fact, you're considered somewhat seasoned, almost on your way to being referenced as the Papa Bear around the base. But for most of us, 24 is a symbol of our youth. If we give it some thought, we can easily come up with some cringe-worthy memories that leave us sitting on the couch in a room by ourselves, staring at the floor and giving knee-jerk facial expressions of disgust and embarrassment over the ignorant things we said or did. You might be recounting some of those moments right now, but don't fret. You'll be glad to relive one of those moments again after hearing Walter Osipoff's story. His story begins on the morning of May 15th, 1941, taking off in a Douglas DC-2. After being airborne for close to an hour, he lands in a SOC 1 biplane. 1 takeoff, 1 landing, 2 different airplanes, and multiple injuries. May 15th, 1941. The location is San Diego, California. The Marine base in question was located on the shore directly adjacent to Lindbergh Field. If anyone travels to San Diego by air nowadays, they land at San Diego International Airport, also known as Lindbergh Field. Pilots these days know it well, as the prevailing winds most always come from the west, forcing you to land on what is now runway 27. The runway's approach has a steeper than normal glide path angle and is coupled with a pesky parking garage slightly to the right of the approach centerline. If you're ever in San Diego, find that parking garage right next to the highway and get yourself to the top level. You'll see some great plane watching, and it feels like you can almost reach out and touch each plane going by. As a passenger, when you touch down on the runway, the airplane makes a left-hand turnoff. If you're on the right side of the plane, take a peek out the window. Some of the old remnants of the base are still there, and some say that the old bones of the once consolidated aircraft factory that produced the B-24 can still be seen. Just down the way from this airport was North Island Naval Base, and on May 15, 1941, at around 9 a.m., stood a Marine named Walter Osipoff. He and 11 other Marines strapped on their parachutes and piled into their DC-2, piloted by Harold Johnson. Walter was a jump master. As I've said previously, he was the old man on campus and was a very seasoned paratrooper at the age of 24. His job was to train and teach the military techniques for jumping out of an airplane. He was also primarily responsible for training soldiers who entered the Army Air Corps as paratroopers, as well as managing any airborne jump operations that he was a part of. Naturally, as a jump master, he was the last one to jump from the airplane. He monitored the safety of all 11 paratroopers that morning and would occasionally release cargo as well during these practice runs. All 11 jumpers were away, and all 11 canopies were sighted. One more 150-pound batch of cargo to deploy, and Walter would jump himself. Walter shoved the cargo out the hatch, and immediately he had a lifelong barstool story. It was a normal Thursday morning for most. The commute to work had been completed. Those that were outside were sipping their coffee, enjoying the fresh sea air. Suddenly, about 3,000 feet above their heads, two Wright R-1830 engines came roaring by, towing something behind it. Could it be an advertisement for the new coffee house down the street? Maybe TWA was announcing new routes or lower fares. Unfortunately, neither. It was Walter being towed 100 feet behind the airplane. To give you an idea of what people were looking up at, the DC-2 wasn't a whole lot different from the DC-3 to the untrained eye. The DC-2 had a boxier, more slab-like fuselage and had some less powerful Wright engines. The DC-3 sported a more rounded fuselage, and most of them were fitted with the Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines. And unless you were a military man or an aviation guru, from 3,000 feet, it was kind of difficult to tell the difference. In fact, the only reason the DC-3 was even produced was because of a request from American Airlines. They, along with many other airlines, already had the DC-2 as part of their fleet. American, though, wanted something called a DST, also known as a Douglas Sleeper Transport. The DC-2, being slab-sided, could carry 14 passengers, but to carry them in a sleeper configuration proved difficult due to the lack of room in the cabin. So American requested a larger cabin from Douglas, which led to the more rounded design of the DC-3. Douglas only agreed to build the DC-3 after American Airlines promised to purchase 20 airplanes, and thus, the more powerful, more aerodynamic, more efficient DC-3 was born. But back to the DC-2 and Walter flailing helplessly behind the airplane. Walter had pushed the 150-pound cargo crate out of the airplane after all the paratroopers had jumped. During the push, the ripcord on the cargo pack got tangled with his own ripcord on his chute. This, in turn, caused his own chute to deploy. The slipstream grabbed his chute and flung him out of the airplane. But Walter now has another problem. There is something called a static line. This line is the attach point for all parachute cables. When a paratrooper jumps, the ripcord is pulled by the resistance of the static line, and the chute deploys. In this instance, the weight of the cargo container and the weight of Walter was too much for the static line. The static line broke at the attach point on the bulkhead, and when it broke, it sent the static line, the cables, harnesses, and Walter's partially deployed chute out the back of the airplane in a tangled mess. Pilot Harold Johnson had his hands full. The mess of tangled aftermath had entwined itself in the elevator. It created a pitch-up movement in the DC-2 that Harold was forced to overcome. Every ounce of energy he had was put into creating downforce on the control yoke in an effort to prevent the aircraft from stalling. He knew there was something hung up on the tail, but didn't immediately know that it was a someone that was hung up. Johnson's only move was to fly as low and as safely as he could to try to alert someone. He recalled flying over a few select marine fields and witnessed heads turned skyward. He honestly had no plan, but had at least hoped that someone down there would have a brilliant idea that he didn't have. Enter Lieutenant William Lowry. He was walking to his hangar that morning when he looked up and witnessed the action. At first glance, he thought it was a test parachute being dragged behind the airplane. It didn't take long to realize, though, that whatever that DC-2 was dragging wasn't being done as planned. As it passed overhead, he could see Walter dangling by his feet and being whipped around by the spiral slipstream. Lowry yelled over to a man named John McCants, who was a mechanic and local test pilot at the Naval Air Station. He signaled John to get the nearby Curtiss Sock Seagull ready. They didn't have time to gas the airplane, and by the time Lowry and McCants were airborne, they really didn't have any idea how much fuel they had on board. The Curtiss Seagull, the Sock 1, was a tandem configuration biplane aircraft. It only had enough capacity for 2 people. William and John filled both of those seats. And there wasn't any time to search for another aircraft that could house the 2 of them, along with Walter. So they were forced to work with what they had. So the Curtiss was airborne, and as they pulled up behind the DC-2, neither one of them had talked about a plan. There was no onboard radio in either airplane, and there was no way for Lowry and McCants to communicate and coordinate. The only thing that they were unified on was that they had both received knives that were thrown at them into the cockpit from service members running to the airplane during engine start saying, "Cut his shroud lines." It's a darn good thing that McCants and Lowry didn't waste any time trying to gas their airplane, because Johnson only had an estimated 10 minutes of fuel left in his DC-2. There was never any need to put a ton of gas on during a practice run. All you were doing was taking off and circling near the airfield for a short period of time. What would you need all that gas for? Cut up, lacerated, battered and bruised, Walter was as good as dead. For 33 minutes, he was flung behind that airplane. 5 other crew members in the DC-2 were heroically trying to pull him back in. They were trying to grab the line, which carried Walter's weight, along with all the drag associated with the silk chutes and the static lines against 110 miles per hour of relative wind. None of the 5 men, by the way, trying to rescue him, had any parachutes. Besides the static lines beating him to a pulp, Walter's chest strap had broken, and his leg straps were hung around his ankles. The noise in the wind growling by him was ripping him apart. He practically had his eyes slammed shut the entire time to shield himself from any more injury, until he heard a faint growl of a radial engine over the sound of the wind rushing past his head. He opened his eyes, and here comes Lowry and McCants. Now, this wasn't as easy as flying up to Walter and grabbing him. There were a lot of dangerous variables involved. Variable number 1, the propeller. The prop of the Curtiss biplane had the capability of ending everyone's day very quickly. If the propeller hits Walter, he's dead, along with Lowry and McCants most likely. If the propeller hits the static lines or chutes, they're all dead as well. Variable number 2, the spiral slipstream from the DC-2. Climate control is a bit of an issue and is extremely unpredictable. The DC-2 creates a wake with both of its radial engines, along with the wake from its enormous wing. In addition, flying slower increases the size of the wake. And besides having a very small window of still air, the wakes are invisible. Variable number 3, time. 10 minutes of fuel left in the DC-2. Either more or less in the Curtiss, and God only knows how much time Walter has left. So with a spinning blade of death on the front of the plane, invisible violent wakes in every direction, and a ticking clock, Lowry makes his first run at Walter. McCants is made ready standing in the rear seat. An extreme gust is hit almost immediately, sending Walter sliding and skidding across the top of the wing multiple times, but with no prop strike, thank God. Lowry realizes the air is way too rough, and flies alongside the DC-2, signaling Johnson to climb to find smoother air. Now, this was exactly what Johnson didn't want to do. He had been using all of his strength to keep the nose down, but he successfully regulated enough pressure off of the yoke to start a shallow climb to smoother air. Single-digit minutes of fuel left for Johnson, and Lowry starts another rescue run. Lowry found himself perfectly positioned underneath Jumpmaster Osipoff. McCants reached up to grab him and pulled him down into the cockpit, but the two of them couldn't fit. The only thing McCants could do was shove Walter's head in the seat, leaving the rest of his body laying horizontal across the aft part of the fuselage. Now for the shroud lines. Walter is clung to McCants for dear life, and McCants is cutting away. Simultaneously, the Sock 1 hits a gust of wind, throwing Lowry and company upward. So far up that the propeller on the Curtiss made contact with the DC-2, tearing a 1-foot section out of the tail. Jolted and stunned, Lowry realized his bird was still in the air and he maintained control. McCants still couldn't manage to cut all the tangled shroud lines with a single knife, while Walter dug permanent holes with his fingers in McCants' side. But during the collision with the DC-2, something happened. The shroud lines came across the top of the wing and across the propeller, severing all of the lines. Everyone was free, but not out of the woods yet. Johnson knew the rescue had been completed, but he still had lines tangled in his elevator. The upforce, though, was a little less aggressive now that he had lost all the weight, but he was down to fumes. Johnson was able to glide the DC-2 to North Island and land safely with dry gas tanks and a mess of tangled lines in the elevator. Lowry was still in the air. Yes, there was a slight weight and balance problem, but the bigger problem was that the chute lines had been caught by the slipstream and lodged themselves in the rudder of the Sock 1, leaving Lowry with almost zero rudder control. Any tailwheel pilots out there listening? Anyone ever try and land a Piper Cub with no rudder or no tailwheel steering? How about with double the weight in the back? Anyone? All McCants and Osipoff could do was hang on and hope Lowry could pull this off. Luckily, Walter's head was buried like an ostrich in the seat, and he couldn't see a thing. Ignorance is bliss, especially after having been traumatized for 33 minutes straight. Lieutenant William Lowry, after performing a mid-air rescue without a report of his own aircraft status, and after having a mid-air collision, landed a crippled airplane with a flight control failure after multiple bounces at North Island. Now let's see. I need a count. Johnson, McCants, Lowry, 5 servicemen in the DC-2, 5, 6, 8 drinks on Walter tonight at the pub. Or maybe after he's released from the hospital. He was treated for injuries sustained in the event over the next 6 months and made a full recovery. The time came once again for the Jumpmaster to get back to work. In January, just 1 month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, newly promoted First Lieutenant Walter Osipoff climbed aboard once again. His buddies were pensive, but he was calm. Every one of them offered to jump first to put his nerves at ease. His reply? To hell with that. I know damn well I'll make it. And out he goes. Both Lowry and McCants were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in one of the most brilliant and daring rescues within the annals of naval history. Not long after his recovery, both the Paramarines and the Marine Raiders began training after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Walter Osipoff was assigned to the 1st Paramarine Regiment. Their regiment was specifically trained to attack by air. The Raiders, by sea. Because of the way they were trained, the Raiders were the ones who saw all the numerous battles in the Solomon Islands. The Paramarines, waiting their turn to be assigned to combat, never got their chance to deploy and were disbanded in late 1943. Walter Osipoff finished his career as a well-decorated lieutenant colonel with the United States Marines, having served in the World War II, Korean, and Cold War theaters. He passed away on July 7th, 2003, at the age of 85. If you ever make your way to San Diego, find some time to visit Greenwood Memorial Park, where he is buried at the Laurel Place plot. Bring some friends, tell them the story, and pay your respects. Hey everyone. I didn't want to interrupt your listening in the middle of the show, so I thought I'd put this at the end. I just wanted to take a brief moment and thank each and every one of you for listening to Warbirds. Now, as you already know, this show airs every 2 weeks. But if you want to narrow that down to once per week, there is a way. There's a members-only site of mine located on Patreon, and for $5 a month, you can gain access to 2 additional shows every month that regular Apple or Google subscribers won't have access to. I'll put a link in the show notes for you to make it easy to get there. Along with these members-only ad-free episodes, you'll gain early access to the regularly published bi-weekly episodes. In addition to that, you'll get a special sneak peek at upcoming episodes in the queue. I'll even be taking suggestions from members as to the topics that you want to hear. So if you're hungry for more stories, and 2 stories per month just won't tide you over, go ahead and download the Patreon app on your device. That's Patreon, or the link in the show notes, and sign up for a free account. Once you've signed up, search for Warbirds and you'll find the show pretty quickly. $5 a month will give you double the amount of shows and lots more. With your support, it'll give me a lot more time to focus on producing quality shows for you, and it'll keep me out of the air and at home more often, which I'm sure my wife would appreciate as well. So thanks so much again for supporting Warbirds, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.